Financial Accounting, Lost Marks Analysis. The objective of this presentation is to equip students so that they are able to perform a lost marks analysis. Practically, this would imply that students should, after they've received a test paper back, perform a lost marks analysis. The objective of a lost marks analysis is to identify reasons why marks were lost. Ultimately, the goal is then to prevent these mistakes from happening again. Losing marks in a paper is a combination of two aspects: poor exam technique or a lack of knowledge, other principles or rules. The following has been identified as possible reasons for losing marks in a test. Each time it is explained through an example with reference to a property, plant and equipment note. Lack of knowledge. You do not know how to calculate depreciation or accumulated depreciation for purposes of preparing the PPE note. Format errors. You lose marks for not preparing the PPE note in the correct format. Principal errors. You capitalize an amount to PPE that should have been recognized as an expense. Not answering the required. The question requires the disclosure of a PPE note, but your answer includes calculations of which none or only some amounts have been transferred to the actual PPE note. Only once the calculations ends up in the PPE note do you answer the question and can you earn sufficient marks. Calculation errors. You do not work accurately by using the incorrect number of months when calculating depreciation for the year. Time management problems. If you do not allow enough time to attempt the question, you cannot earn sufficient marks. All of these possible reasons for losing marks can either be classified as due to a lack of knowledge or because of poor exam technique. When performing a lost marks analysis, students should compare their own answer sheets to the suggested solutions received back from the lecturer. We will now do an exercise like that and analyze this property, plant and equipment note performed by a student and identify reasons why the student only earned 7.5 out of a possible 15 marks. When we refer to the suggested solution, you will identify and note that there is certain format marks awarded as well as calculation and principal mark-through marks. First of all, you can see that there was format marks awarded for the following: for having a proper heading, identifying the name of the entity, a heading notes for the year ended, and that it is the property, plant and equipment note. Another format mark for having an opening carrying amount reconciled to a closing carrying amount. Format marks for having line items revaluation, depreciation and additions. Narrative information is also an important part of a PPE note. Format marks were awarded for identifying the date of the most recent revaluation, the fact that it was performed by an independent valuer with reference to market evidence. Because this asset is measured in accordance with the revaluation model, in the narrative information you also need information on what the carrying amount would have been had this asset been measured on the cost model. That's another half a format mark. To calculate what the carrying amount would have been on the cost model in calculation 8 is worth 1.5 marks. Let's now see what the student did. The student earned the half a mark for having a heading to the note, but because the student excluded the name of the entity, the student lost half a mark for not having the proper format. The student earned half a mark for having an opening carrying amount and another half a mark for having a closing carrying amount that's reconciled. But because the opening carrying amount only refers to a cost price for this asset, the student lost half a mark for also mentioning that it could represent a revalued amount, which is incorrect. The student earned half a mark each time for having revaluation, depreciation, and additions as line items. In the narrative information, the student identified the date of the recent valuation, reference to an independent valuer, and the market evidence. But because of a lack of knowledge, the student did not include what the carrying amount would have been on the cost model. That was worth 2 marks, half a format mark and 1.5 marks for the calculation of the carrying amount on the cost model. So, having looked at this, the student already lost format marks for not having a proper PPE note format, and because of a lack of knowledge, excluded narrative information. If we now look at the calculations and how the marks was awarded for that, it's very important that students note the following. If we refer to calculation 1 for the opening cost, the solution received back from the lecturer indicates that that amount is worth 1 mark, equals 1. If you refer to calculation 1, you will now see that that is made up of half a mark for the 4 million and half a mark for the 650,000. Please note, calculation 1, opening cost, is only worth 1 mark. Students should not make the mistake and think that it is now worth 2 marks. So to get to the 4.6 million, it was 2 half a marks. If we look at the calculation of accumulated depreciation in calculation 2, that was worth 2 marks. In calculation 2, that is made up of a mark through for whatever cost price the student calculated, less 100,000 residual value over 10 years for 4 years. That will then give you the 2 marks that calculation 2 is worth. Let's see what the student did. In calculation 1, the student did have the 4 million plus the 650 and earned those marks. But what the student also did is to add an expense of 20,000 that should have been expensed and not capitalized to the carrying amount of the asset. That is what we refer to as a principal error. So half a mark was lost in that case. Calculation 2 for the accumulated depreciation, the student earned the mark through half, the over 10 years for 4 years, but the student, due to a lack of knowledge, did not take the residual value into account and therefore lost half a mark. If we now refer to the next calculation, that's for revaluations in calculation 3, that is worth 1 mark in calculation 3. That is for taking the net replacement cost and deducting the carrying amount from that. The carrying amount is half a mark through, worth half a mark through. The depreciation for the year in Calc 4 is worth 1.5. In Calc 4, that is the 3 million half a mark net replacement cost less the residual value of 100,000, and now the student needs to know it's divided by the remaining useful life years, which is 6. Let's see what the student did. For a revaluation, the student got half a mark for taking the net replacement cost, half a mark through for using the carrying amount that the student calculated, and that gave the student 198,000 revaluation surplus. But if you now refer to the movements in the PPE note, the student included this revaluation surplus as a negative movement. That is a principal error, and therefore the student lost half a mark. If we look at the depreciation calc by the student, calculation 4, the student earned the half for the 3, half for the 100,000 residual, but then the student didn't work accurately and divided that by 5 instead of 6, remaining useful life years. So this is an example of where the student didn't work accurately. The last calculation I want to refer to is the additions. That is in calculation 5 with 1.5 marks. That is the 1,050,000 and 600,000. That was an addition at the end of the financial year. It didn't have an influence on the revaluation or the depreciation and should just have been included as an addition. If we now refer back to what the student did, you'll note the following. The student did calculate this amount as the 1,000,000 plus the 50,000 plus the 600,000. So all 3 half marks was earned. But if you refer back to the student's PPE note, which was the required, there's no amount included for additions. So this is an example of where a student calculated amount but didn't use it to answer the question. Now, depending on the subject involved, it would either not be marked at all, could be divided by 2, 3, or 4. In this instance, we awarded the 1.5 marks, but it was divided by 3 because the student didn't use the amount to answer the question. After this lost marks analysis have been performed by the student should prepare a summary of the reasons why these marks have been lost. This can be done on a piece of paper and attached to every question received back. Please note, you have to identify reasons why marks was lost, and then you should take action so that you do not make the same mistakes again.